Okay, it is 6:05. I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to our panel on degrowth and the Green New Deal. We have a lot prepared to discuss today with 3 expert speakers and a wonderful discussion moderator. So I'll try to keep this intro short. This panel will be about 2 hours long and we'll have a short 5-minute break at the 1-hour mark around 7 p.m. The last half hour of the event will be reserved for audience questions. My name is Sophia, one of the organizers for this panel. I represent the University College Literary and Athletic Society, or UCLit Sustainability Commission here at U of T, as well as LEAP chapter at U of T. UCLit Sustainability is a climate advocacy student group aiming to actively engage our constituents within University College, as well as students within U of T, on politically relevant issues in environmental activism. LEAP U of T is a University Toronto chapter of the global organization The Leap, which focuses on some of the same intersections of environmental and social justice that we'll be discussing today. Our campus groups organize rallies, solidarity actions, and educational events like this one. So if you're a UC student, UCLit Sustainability is a great way to get involved. And if you're a U of T student, UC or not, interested in helping out with LEAP, don't hesitate to reach out either. Our chat mods will be putting some contact info into the chat right now, and we will be including them in our list of webinar resources following the event. For our audience members, please keep your microphones muted for the duration of the event to minimize any background noise, and please use the chat to ask any questions you may have for our speakers. Our chat moderators, Alex and Layla, if you guys could wave, we'll note them down, and we will save these questions for the last half hour of the webinar. They will also be posting links and resources into the chat throughout the event. To view only the speakers on your screen as they speak, you can toggle to speaker view in the top right corner of your screen. If anyone has any technical difficulties during the event, please feel free to message me or Alex and Layla privately, and we will do our best to assist you. Some accessibility notes: we absolutely do not tolerate any hateful or discriminatory behavior at this event. If any of this should happen, our chat moderators will deal with the issue accordingly. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the UCLit YouTube channel with closed captions available following the event. The link to our YouTube channel will be posted in the chat. We'll also post in the Facebook event page, which is, I hope, where everyone found us through for this webinar when the recording is uploaded, along with a compilation of any resources that are mentioned during the webinar. That's about it for housekeeping. Moving on, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We're grateful that with video conferencing, we're able to bring this panel to a wider audience of people from many places. Our groups are based in a city called Toronto, and many viewers may have ties to this place, so I'm going to talk about it for this land acknowledgement. This place we call Toronto has been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years. The name Toronto has its origins in a word in the Wendat language that refers to a type of dam used for fishing. For millennia, this land was an important gathering place for Indigenous peoples to engage in seasonal fishing activities, commerce, and cultural exchange. And for this reason, this word that named our city has taken on many other meanings in diverse Indigenous languages, meanings such as the gathering place. So even in the naming of our city, we can see that this place was and still is an important gathering place for Indigenous peoples. This land has been inhabited by the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations. In the Dish with One Spoon, the dish is the land around the Great Lakes, with all of its resources, and each of us has just one spoon with which to eat. By using the spoon to take only what we need, we leave land and resources for others to enjoy, as we all work together to secure the livelihoods of future generations. As an uninvited guest and immigrant settler on this land, I commit and implore those of you watching to listening, caring, and advocating as the best allies as we can be for Indigenous autonomy and land sovereignty. Canada's long history of cultural genocide has resulted in profound Indigenous suffering, and we must act as angry agents for change and accountability for the greater institutions that continue to perpetrate harm upon people and land. We cannot move forward until Indigenous narratives and perspectives are prioritized. If you'd like to learn more about the Indigenous history of Toronto, an excellent overview was published in issue number 1 of U of T's First Nations House magazine. The link will be posted in the chat shortly. And with that, our discussion moderator, Dr. Chandni Desai, will take it away.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Chandni Desai. I am an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Equity Studies program at New College. I'd like to begin tonight's discussion by first introducing the speakers. We have with us today Dr. Robert Pollin, University Professor of Economics and co-director of the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts-Amherst. We also have with us Dr. Mijin Cha, Assistant Professor of Urban and Environmental Policy at Occidental College. And we have Dr. Susan Paulson, Professor in the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida. The way I would like to begin today is by asking our speakers to begin with brief remarks, opening remarks for about 5 minutes each. And then we are going to proceed to a dialogue format where I will be posing questions that have been developed by the organizers of the event. And then the panelists will respond accordingly based on their areas of expertise and their background. Those of you that are listening and want to pose a question, please pose your question in the chat, and our chat facilitators will collect those questions, which will then be posed to the speakers towards the end of this conversation. So I hope that the ground rules around Q&A are slightly clear. So perhaps we can begin with you, Robert, with your opening remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing it. I myself have been on both sides of these kinds of events as a speaker and an organizer. I know from deep experience that it's a lot harder to be an organizer than a speaker. So I appreciate the opportunity to get off easy, but I want to express my respect for the work that the organizers have done to start. So let me just give some overview of where I think we are, the state of the world, and give you a brief sense of some of my own work. It's very clear that we at the moment face truly, and this is not hyperbole, truly unprecedented set of crises, historically unprecedented, in that we're facing a COVID pandemic, and the idea that, you know, there should be a virus that basically shuts down the entire world economy would have seemed preposterous 7 months ago, but here we are. Second, that has triggered an economic depression that in its severity is comparable only to what happened in the 1930s. Now, it's true, we don't know how long this one is going to last. Hopefully, it is not going to last 10 years like the 1930s. But to date, in terms of the drop in economic activity and its impact on people's lives, certainly in the United States, where I'm most familiar, I think also in Canada, maybe to a somewhat lesser degree, this is a absolutely devastating moment in economic history. Third is, of course, the climate crisis, and that's the one on which we're going to focus. So I will come back to that. The climate crisis, as opposed to the pandemic and the depression, economic depression, is a long-term, long-gathering event. And though the pandemic and the depression are, of course, severe, the climate crisis is unique in that it actually creates a threat to the continuation of life on Earth as we know it. And that's real. That also is not hyperbole. The fourth one is, of course, the thing that has emerged, but has been around for thousands of years, as Sophia's opening remarks expressed eloquently, is the depth of racism, certainly as we are experiencing in the United States, and the fact that what has happened in the last couple of months has brought to the fore the ongoing extent and depth of racism in the United States. And I think we can think about addressing that issue within the context of some of these other considerations. Okay, my own work. So my background is as an economist. So my own work getting into this question was to address the issue that was prevalent, remains prevalent around climate change, which is we've heard for decades, especially let's say over the last decade, that okay, we really can be concerned about climate change. Important, yes. But the argument is, well, if you want to do something about climate change, that's fine, but it is going to mean serious harm in terms of economic well-being. More specifically, we can think about a trade-off. If you want to protect the environment, if you want to reduce emissions, okay, but that's going to mean loss of jobs and loss of income for ordinary people. And so it's a trade-off. One or the other, choose one. There are a lot of polls that ask that question, and it wasn't like, is this the right set of questions? It's one or the other, choose one, including in the New York Times and other serious places. And as an economist, I was thinking about this. This is almost 20 years ago now. I said, this can't possibly be right. Why can't it be right? Well, let's think of analogies. When you hear about these issues with respect to military spending, it's always, well, we may not like military spending, but investing in the military is good for jobs. So it occurred to me, well, if investing in the military is good for jobs, why can't investing in a green economy be good for jobs? Protecting our livelihoods, both in the sense of incomes and in the sense of climate stability. So that was really where my own research got launched on this. And so subsequent to that, I've been really focusing on this issue of how we can create a clean energy transformation that will achieve the imperative of climate stabilization, and specifically bring down our CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions to the levels necessary. And what we understand now, that level necessary is zero emissions by 2050, no later than 2050. And how to get there in a way that also promotes broad well-being, that advances job opportunities, good jobs, that reduces poverty, that creates broadly shared economic well-being. That's really the question around which my work has focused. Now, of course, in doing that, there are detailed, complicated questions that really aren't that complicated, such as how do you pay for this whole thing, such as where do you get the land to put up all the solar panels and wind turbines. And another question is, well, what about low-income countries? Does India have to do the same thing as the United States, get its emissions down, invest in a clean energy economy? They didn't put the emissions up in the air in the first place. Well, the answer is yes, India does have to do it, but the way we finance it is that the US, other rich countries that are responsible for putting the emissions into the air that have polluted our global environment have to subsidize investments in low-income countries. So these are the types of questions around which my work is focused, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to discuss them further as we proceed.
Thank you. Mijin, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Chandni, and thank you to all the organizers. As Dr. Pollin mentioned, it's much easier to be a presenter than to bring all of this together, and I have to say it's been such a smooth process coming together, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Mijin Cha. I'm an assistant professor at Occidental College, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about some work that I've done that is definitely builds upon Dr. Pollin's work on green economy in this area that we call just transition. And just transition is becoming, an increasingly popular term. And as usually happens when these things become popularized, there are some people who use the term in a way that really honors the roots of the term, and there are others that use it as a cover for greenwashing. And you see increasing pushback from folks that, just transition is just really a fancy term that covers up the fact that a lot of people will lose their jobs, and it just makes people feel better about this oncoming large-scale unemployment. And of course, these concerns are magnified given the moment that we're in, as mentioned, that the COVID crisis has caused millions more people to lose their jobs. So we are at a moment where not only do we have this moment of high rates of unemployment, but we are also asking people to increase unemployment by stop using fossil fuels. And I think that, as mentioned previously, this is a false choice, right? This is not, we don't have to do it this way. So just some background on the idea of just transition. Just transition has its roots in labor environmentalism, and the late great labor leader Tony Mazzocchi, who was the head of the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, talked about how there were some jobs that were just too dangerous to do, that they were dangerous for workers and that they were dangerous for societies. But these jobs, the loss of these jobs should not be borne by the workers. And in fact, we as a society should support these workers as they transition into different careers. And he mentioned this term, this idea of a super fund for workers. In the US, the super fund program is basically something that is paid into by hazardous waste operators that then they have a fund to help clean up the waste. And Mazzocchi's idea is that we'd have a super fund for workers. So for workers in industries that were too dangerous to continue, we'd have this fund that would help them transition in terms of wage support them as when they become displaced from their work, and also help transition them into new careers. And around the same time, environmental advocates also noted that it's not just workers that suffer, but also communities, right? So the communities where these hazardous waste plants are located also suffer. Fossil fuel communities also suffer from all of the negative impacts of fossil fuel extraction and use. So just transition to me is the recognition that there will be negative economic and social consequences to decarbonization. But that doesn't mean that we don't do it, right? Instead, it shows that there's a duty for us to mitigate these harms. Recognizing the negative impacts of ending fossil fuel extraction and use is no excuse to continue fossil fuel extraction and use, but there must be recognition that there are negative impacts. And that just means that we need to target and have dedicated resources to these workers and communities that have borne the burden of the fossil fuel industry so that we can transition them in a way that is just. But I think there's also a broader project within the idea of just transition. And that is really the question that is driving a lot of my research, which is what are we transitioning into, right? So it's not just that we are replacing fossil fuel jobs with renewable energy jobs, but as we transition into low carbon future, what are we transitioning into? And here I really look to ideas that have come from the environmental justice and climate justice community movements, where we really think about the idea of moving from extraction to regeneration. And the idea of extraction is not just extraction of resources, but extraction in terms of extraction of labor, extraction of wealth, and extraction of people. So things like incarceration is an extraction of people from their communities. And so as we move from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, these issues must be fundamental to this broader project of moving away from extraction. So for instance, when we think about a Green New Deal, we see that there are a lot of social and economic interests integrated into climate policies. And that is fundamentally necessary because things like health insurance healthcare are needed, particularly in the country as the US, where healthcare is tied to your job. So when you lose your job, you will lose your healthcare, as we have seen millions of people happen to millions of people. I'm just laughing because Susan is doing some really very funny hand signals, which is very helpful. And yes, that's losing their healthcare, they've lost their job. It's terrible. A Green New Deal, we need to understand these challenges and integrate them into our climate policy. I think, as we think about also the scale and scope of decarbonization, it is really a transition on the level that we have not really experienced or seen before. When we think about how integrated fossil fuels are into our economy and into our society, transitioning away from that is a project on a scale that we have yet to see. I think that can be very daunting, but I also think it's really exciting because we live in a time of record levels of inequality and record temperatures. Something has to change. So as we think about this idea of just transition, I think we can think about what are we transitioning into, and then really understand and embrace that it must be just. We cannot, low carbon, low wage jobs is not a just transition. And we can transition in a way that values communities and workers and also ensures that we stop the worst impacts of climate change. So thank you again for having me. I'll stop here and I really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Susan, would you like to go next?
All right. I'm grateful to join this conversation and to continue learning with the valuable work of these fellow guests and everyone else here. So I've been studying largely through everyday practice, through empirical research, for many years Andean and Amazonian communities, learning about the way they manage their environments, their production and reproduction of their lives. So I lived full-time for 15 years in South America. I also taught sustainability studies in Europe for 5 years, seeing a very different positioning about environmental issues and change. And now I work at Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Florida that has a hemispheric view. So it's been quite an interesting path to be located in such different positions and experiences. And it's led me to consider a few key questions. One is, what are the global dynamics, the historical present dynamics that interconnect political ecologies from North and South, that connect those small communities I lived with and worked with in the Amazon with, say, US or Sweden or big northern economies? And the second question I have is, how can we recognize and value practices and meanings of human-environment relations that are deeply different from the ones that dominate northern societies? From the kind of assumptions and analyses that we use even to make decisions about just transitions, about dealing with climate change. So one of the ideas that allows me to think about these questions is called degrowth. Now, today I'll talk a little bit about some of the experiences I've had with this movement. And one of the things that's really nourishing for me is that degrowth engages inseparably biological and social cultural issues and dynamics. So we ally with virtually all natural scientists that say we need to curb anthropogenic entropy, right? Growth of material and energy use is causing destruction of the planet that needs to be stopped. And also with many social scientists who seek to halt the harnessing of socioeconomic, racial, geopolitical inequalities for the purpose of economic expansion. Some of those things that we just heard are that we're trying to address through just transitions. Anyway, in looking at these inseparably linked natural and social processes and needs to change course, I also value learning from local communities. And there's sort of two different processes that I think are super valuable. One is people remembering and recuperating older life ways, sometimes from centuries of tradition, that have sustainability and equity in the forefront. Another one are people, some of those and other people, forging new life ways to deal with climate change, with racism, with inequities that we're dealing with right now. It's kind of hard, sometimes those life ways, those cosmologies seem incommensurate with Western science or with legal legislation we're dealing or whatever. And so one of the things I'm really interested in is how we can have those conversations across difference, not just different identities. Oh, there's a woman, there's an indigenous person, but the sort of deep territorial worlds from which they come that produce those people. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to move us back to Robert. So we're going to begin with the questions. You know, you've stated in an article for the New Left Review, I quote, "I share virtually all the values and concerns of degrowth advocates," end quote, "but disagree on its viability due to concerns about degrowth not inherently leading to sustainability and shortcomings as a definite program. In contrast, you've advocated for a Green New Deal as the solution to the climate crisis. So can you tell us what the Green New Deal is, what it seeks to achieve, the shortcomings of degrowth, and how you believe a Green New Deal addresses these?
Very happy. Thank you for the very good question. So basically, the climate crisis has many features, but the most central one is the ongoing increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and even more specifically, CO2 emissions being emitted into the atmosphere. So at present, global emissions are about 33 billion tons per year. That's 33 billion tons. If we follow the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the UN-based institution that really collects the research of climate scientists, basically generates consensus, slightly maybe conservative positions. But anyway, they came out with a report in October 2018, which said that in order to achieve something like climate stabilization and to not risk the prospect of ending human life on Earth as we know it merely, we need to think about driving CO2 emissions down by 45% as of 2030. That's only like 9 years from now. And going to net zero emissions by 2050. Okay, so my understanding, at least my way of framing the Green New Deal, is the project is exactly what the IPCC says we need to do. We need to get emissions down by roughly 50% in 10 years, and we need to be at net zero in 30 years, okay? That's it. Now, in order to achieve that, the fundamentals are simple. There's a lot of complicated stuff, but the fundamentals are simple, in my opinion. The first thing we need to do is dramatically increase the efficiency at which we utilize energy resources. We waste massive amounts of energy. It's entirely plausible to think we can operate the US economy, the Canadian economy, the global economy at twice the efficiency level that we operate today with fairly reasonable levels of investments. That means, for example, that the house I'm sitting in, or my office building, or my car, or the buses can go from point A to point B using half the level of energy that it uses now, for example. Okay, so energy efficiency, massive investments. Secondly is to transition entirely out of fossil fuel energy and to supplant it with clean renewable energy, primarily solar energy and wind power, okay? And also geothermal, some hydro. We can talk about some clean variants of bioenergy. So that's basically the project, to build up massively energy efficiency and to and clean renewable energy, and therefore also to supplant fossil fuel energy, so that by 2050 we use essentially no fossil fuel energy whatsoever. Okay, so that's the project, and those investments in clean energy are going to generate jobs. They're going to generate millions of jobs. In a global setting, they're going to generate tens of millions of jobs per year, and some of my own work has calculated that. And my own work, working with co-authors and friends, suggests that something in the range of investing about 2.5% of global GDP per year will be needed just for those clean energy investments, okay? So we're talking about a massive growth of clean energy investments, and concurrently a massive contraction to zero of fossil fuel energy. The growth of clean energy investments will generate tens of millions of jobs. There will be job losses, as Mijin said, through the contraction of the fossil fuel economy, and the just transition is fundamentally about making sure the workers and communities are not affected. Okay, or they are compensated fairly. Okay, so that's basically it. We can go through. I saw somebody in the chat box ask me about other emissions, and of course, there are other greenhouse gas emissions. CO2 is, on a global scale, it's about 70% of all emissions. In the United States, it's about 80%. So we got to start there. Okay, degrowth. As you said in the question, I share the values of degrowth proponents, and I agree with a lot of what they say. We aren't enemies. At the same time, let's think about the degrowth agenda if we want to be specific. As I said, right now, the global economy operates with 33 billion tons of CO2 emissions coming out every year. We've got to get it to zero. Okay, if we want to get to zero emissions through reducing economic activity, let's do some really simple arithmetic. Let's say we contract economic activity by 10% and we don't change the energy system at all, okay? We reduce economic activity by 10%, but otherwise we keep the fossil fuel-based dominant energy system in place. Okay, 10% reduction, we have 33 billion tons of emissions, and then we will have 30 billion. 10% of 33 billion is 33 billion tons minus 3 billion tons. In other words, the degrowth agenda accomplishes on its own almost nothing in terms of reducing emissions. What we would still have to do is supplant our fossil fuel-based emissions economy with a clean energy economy. We will have to massively expand the clean energy economy in any case, and we will get a lot of jobs. If we rely on contracting the level of economic activity, a 10% reduction in economic activity, another word for that is a Great Depression. We have the situation we're in now, we didn't see 10% contraction of activity. Maybe we saw 5%. So I have been on, yes, thank you for citing my work in the New Left Review. I've been in debates on this for several years, including with economists I respect a lot, including the leading, I think, economist working on this, the Canadian Peter Victor of York University. In all these debates, I've never heard any person, with all due respect, tell me how you avoid massive employment losses, a huge depression, if you're going to contract economic activity. So, and in any case, we're playing with words. What we really need is to massively grow the clean energy economy. It will increase GDP, but I don't care if it increases GDP. We need it to save the planet.
Thank you. So Susan, you've noted that degrowth is an umbrella term uniting philosophies that differ in some ways and share common understandings and goals. Can you explain some commonalities around the idea and practice of degrowth?
Okay. Thank you. So degrowth strives to shift the course of societies and cultures away from growth and toward equitable and sustainable well-being. This formidable endeavor brings together actors and groups with wildly different approaches and varying scales and timeframes. So I see sort of two goals that unite this heterogeneous community. One is stop increasing the global quantity of material and energy used by humans each day. It's basically a thermodynamic goal, right? And the second one is reorient values, social systems, and politics around well-being, not growth. Paths toward these goals range from some people who eat homegrown vegan food and practice common provisioning and co-living arrangements to others who apply high-tech science and value chain analytics to re-engineer global food systems around environmental sustainability and health rather than profit, putting in the kind of efficiencies that Bob mentioned because you've got different motives. So in my understanding, there's quite a resistance amongst people that engage degrowth to have one theory, one agenda, sort of dogma of what it is. We're engaged in a lot of conversations across difference, and the book called The Case for Degrowth that co-authors and I wrote, that's just out this month, we advance a set of policies that we like, right? A package of policies. The first one is the Green New Deal. Second, universal basic incomes and services, reclaiming commons, reduction of working hours, and changes in public finance. I think all degrowth advocates that I know commit to end material growth, stop the increasing transformation of more and more matter and energy. Some are also concerned with economic growth, others are indifferent. I was surprised to hear, I think I maybe misunderstood that Bob thought degrowth was about provoking economic contraction as a means to reduce material growth or other things. There may be people that are doing that. That's not the most common way, or I'm not so familiar with people that think meddling with the economy is the way to meet those other goals, or purposely provoking recessions or contractions. One relationship is fundamental over time. Data show between countries through time, very tight correlations between growth of GDPs and growth of ecological footprints. So to date, every additional dollar of GDP brings additional environmental costs. There are possibilities for partially decoupling. Bob talked about possibilities for making things more efficient. That's really important to work on. But that doesn't break the fact that those have been always coupled and will take a while to separate. So for me, I see Green New Deal and degrowth as quite complementary moves to address socioeconomic and environmental challenges in integrated ways. Green New Deals introduce policy and institutional reforms designed to quickly curb carbon emissions and economic crises. Degrowth seeks historic transitions away from the sociocultural systems and values that produce climate change and crisis economies in the first place, and that continue to sustain them. So it's a much sort of deeper, longer term project, a project of civilization change, versus a more efficient, quick, programmed move of Green New Deals. And I think they both have an absolutely fundamental role in working together. One point of contention that I think is interesting is around economics, right? Economic growth, the role of it. The USGND, in the USGND proposal, the achievement of net zero greenhouse gas and just transition is explicitly linked to economic growth, to green growth, which it may be political expedience, it may be various reasons. In the Green New Deal for Europe, Pillar 8 is called Ending the Dogma of Endless Growth. And it proclaims, quote, "We must abandon GDP growth as a primary measure of progress. Instead, we need to focus on what matters: health, happiness, and the environment." And so there's questions about the role that economic growth or change plays in this. And I think, again, I'll turn back to the point that most degrowth work that I know focuses on policies and changes to foreground well-being, and provoking economic contraction is not necessarily one that comes through. Bob mentioned he'd never heard anyone talk about what's going to happen with the massive unemployment. A lot of degrowth people write about changes in the structures of jobs. Shin mentioned before that in the US, to get health insurance, you have to have a full-time job, et cetera, right? It's very difficult to do professional work part-time. But if we restructure economies to allow people like all of us to work 20, 30 hours a week and spend other parts of our time doing political activism or gardening or parenting, that will open more spaces for people who are unemployed, and also allow us to transition towards a society where we can certainly produce everything we need with less hours of labor time. I mean, our productivity is so enormous now. We're far beyond the fact where we need everyone to be working 40 or 50 hours a week. So that's just one point. Anyway, there's much to debate here, so I'm looking forward to more discussions.
Thank you. So Mijin, moving to a question for you. Historically, the jobs versus the environment narrative has divided environmentalists and working class union members on the issue of climate action. Workers in the fossil fuel industry would suffer unemployment and the loss of livelihoods during the transition to a clean energy economy. But the flip side is suffering global environmental catastrophe if we continue harmful extractivist practices. So can you talk a little bit about, or more on the idea of a just transition, and how we can consider both jobs and the environment when it comes to policy making?
Sure, and thank you for such a great question. When we think about this jobs versus environment tension, we have to recognize that it's a false dichotomy. But also, if we think historically about how it came about, right? It was really when companies were forced to do environmental regulations because they were polluting, they would then say, well, if we have to do this, it's going to cost more money and you'll lose your job, right? So as we see, it is actually not about workers being against environmentalists. The only people that benefit from this tension are corporations and industry. So this is a structural creation, right? It is manufactured. There is nothing inherent about work that makes it incompatible with environmental protection or climate protection. And again, to reference Tony Mazzocchi, who is one of my heroes, and also I've just recently reread his biography, so he's very much in the front of my mind, is that he actually said that environmental concerns should be integrated into workers' concerns, because in fact, the pollution that we see in society and communities comes often from workplaces, which means that environmental regulation and climate regulation is a workplace issue, and as such, workers should be concerned about it. I think this jobs versus environment false narrative also ignores the fact that workers are also community members, right? They often live in communities that are impacted by polluted environments. And in fact, what happens is that they have to choose between either having a job and being able to feed their family, or breathing clean air, right? And again, I cannot stress this enough, that this is a condition that is manufactured and structural, right? No one should ever have to choose between feeding their family or breathing clean air. So understanding this and understanding that it is a false dichotomy that is really used to advance corporate interest, we can craft policies to make sure that we don't put people in these situations. When we think about just transition, I think it's also important to understand that we have a history of unjust transition. So we have to understand that their workers are right to be distrustful of this idea that when we say we will transition all of you into jobs that pay the same amount and have the same benefits, and we will make sure that communities don't lose their tax bases, because historically we have been largely unable to do this. And if we think about the scale of decarbonization, that just makes the issue so much more impactful and daunting. So in terms of what we have to do, I think we have to understand that there are short-term things that we need to do, and that there are long-term things that we need to do. In the short term, we need to make sure that we take care of the workers that are displaced. So wage replacements, benefits replacement, making sure that their pension contributions continue. Again, mentioned healthcare insurance, health insurance. It's very hard to call it healthcare because I feel like we don't actually provide care, but so health insurance. And then also for communities, right? So we have to ensure that these communities have some kind of way to replace their lost tax revenue. In the long term, we really have to reimagine these local economies and these regional economies and what these communities and workers can do. So here I think I can give a pretty concrete example of some work that I've been doing in New York called Climate Jobs New York. And it's a way for us to think about how can we craft policies to ensure that we're both ambitiously reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also creating good jobs. Because again, I cannot state enough that a low carbon future full of low wage jobs is not a just transition. So in Climate Jobs New York, it's part of an initiative at the Worker Institute at Cornell University, where I'm a fellow. And the initiative is called Labor Leading on Climate. And it's a proactive, pro-climate vision from the labor movement. And over a series of over about 18 months, we brought together unions across the state and asked them, if you could think about climate policy that would create the most good jobs, union jobs, what would that look like? We focused on 3 sectors: the energy sector, transportation, and buildings. And we came up with a policy platform that is both, again, ambitious in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and ambitious in terms of job creation. That report then led to the creation of Climate Jobs New York. And Climate Jobs New York worked closely with Governor Cuomo's office, and he announced a $1.4 billion investment to create 40,000 climate jobs. He also announced the largest offshore wind procurement in the US that will be built with a project labor agreement, which means that it will essentially be built with union labor. And I think that these examples are important because they show empirical evidence that we can create jobs in a low carbon economy that are good jobs, right? We have to recognize that a lot of solar jobs now are non-union and they don't pay that great. So we have to really focus and be deliberate on crafting policies that ensure that we are creating good jobs. There's nothing that makes low carbon or renewable energy jobs inherently good. We have to make them good jobs. And we make them good jobs through job standards, through wage requirements, having pathways to careers, and ensuring access to unions. These are things that we have to do to ensure that these jobs are good jobs. So again, there's nothing inherent about climate jobs that make them good jobs, and there's no truth that we have to either choose jobs or the environment, right? We need to understand that when we split these two communities, when we split workers and we put them against the community, that dampens their power, right? That splits the power, and the only people that really benefit are corporations.
Thank you. So I am going to move us to a second set of questions. We are supposed to take a break in 10 minutes, but I think that I'm going to, as the moderator, jig the thing on, our schedule a little based on, I don't know, my own thoughts right now. And what I was hoping that we could do is go through one round of questions, then take a 5-minute break, and then open it up for Q&A from the audience. I think that might work really well because I don't want us to break up this conversation. So I'm going to actually move to Robert on the question of, advocates for the Green New Deal favor public options against the clear failures of capitalism. You've noted, however, much of the fossil fuel industry is publicly owned. How do we go further that simple nationalization with respect to industrial planning, regulations, and standards?
So, right, it's not actually the case that much of the fossil fuel assets are publicly owned. 90% of global fossil fuel assets are owned by governments. So to suggest that the solution to transitioning to a clean energy economy is to nationalize fossil fuel assets is not going to get us very far on its own. In fact, it's not going to get us anywhere on its own. What we have to do is obviously embed the issues. The fundamental thing is getting the emissions to zero and do it in a just way. And Mijin's discussion on this was excellent. I will just also acknowledge having been hugely influenced by Tony Mazzocchi. And in fact, the author of the biography that Mijin was reading was a graduate school classmate of mine. So there are arguments for nationalization, especially like in the United States right now, because of the economic depression we're in. It so happens that the US government could buy 51% of the entire US fossil fuel industry right now for $350 billion. That is a lot of money. On the other hand, we just had a stimulus program that was $2 trillion. And the Federal Reserve, on top of that, is putting out, maybe, we don't know for sure, $5-6 trillion pumping into the economy. So it would be very easy, of course it's not going to happen, but just as an exercise, we could buy the US fossil fuel industry tomorrow, but buying it is not going to do any good if they keep doing the same things. But then at that point, we eliminate the massive resistance of the fossil fuel industry in the United States to a clean energy transition, and we have a gradual transition that respects the well-being of workers and communities. So that would be an advantage for nationalization. At the same time, we know that throughout the world, not so much in the US, but throughout the world, the publicly owned fossil fuel industry is very happy with what they've got. And though the assets are publicly owned, we also know that the managers make a lot of money. They enjoy the perquisites of their job, and they don't have the imagination to think about a transition out of fossil fuels, because fossil fuels is the way they earn their livelihood. So we need to have a total transition out of fossil fuels, whatever it takes. Now, as it happens, when we think about a transition out of fossil fuels and into clean energy, it also opens up opportunities for small-scale operations that can be publicly owned, that can be community-owned, that can be cooperatives, that can be individuals. I mean, I myself, both in my home right now and in the office where I work, though I'm not allowed to go there right now, they are net zero buildings already. So we are our own little utility here at home and where I go to work. Distributed energy, small scale, putting solar panels on roofs, driving electric cars. You can operate net zero buildings and you don't have to have anything to do with utilities over time when we learn how to store energy. So that creates the opportunity for co-ops. It creates community-based energy systems. The greatest beneficiaries of this will actually be in the developing world, in rural economies, where if we look at sub-Saharan Africa right now, roughly 50% of people do not have access to electricity, despite promises from politicians. Every time somebody gets elected, they say, we're going to set up a utility. It never happens. The opportunity to do it on a small scale is the opportunity to empower people. And so that's the mindset on which we have to develop the idea of a Green New Deal globally that is not only about nationalization. It's about transitioning to clean energy and empowering people and communities.
Thank you. Susan, moving to you, in Degrowth, Culture, Power, and Change, you question the use of GDP as a measurement of a country's progress and present some alternatives to this. Could you give us some examples of different philosophies or policies that have been put forth for measuring progress separately from economic growth?
Sure. So GDP was never meant to be a measure of well-being, of the wealth of nations. It's a measure of the circulation of money through formal markets. Does its job. For complex political reasons, it's been pushed as a major political and personal desire and dream. But increasingly, that's been questioned, right? I mean, in the 90s, Amartya Sen wrote Development as Freedom, thinking about different ways. There was a well-known book by Wilkinson and Pickett in 2011, The Spirit Level, where both of those and many others show that above extremely low economic thresholds, there's very weak empirical correlation between higher GDPs or GDPs per capita with other outcomes that many of us desire in society. Higher rates of longevity, literacy, equality, security, political participation, mental or physical health, happiness, maybe lower rates of incarceration, obesity, homicide, suicide. Those things that we say and feel we desire don't come together with growing GDP or relatively high GDP, right? They correlate in very irregular ways. So people have developed various ways to try to observe and document, compare and measure the well-being of nations and people. One of them is the Legatum Prosperity Index, which tells the story of human progress sort of beyond market economics, asking how nations flourish by providing opportunity and freedom to citizens, quality of healthcare, education, etc. One example that is quite interesting for me is the gross national happiness that's been developed in Bhutan over now 40 years, right? It's a long time commitment to building an economy that's not directed towards or driven by GDP growth, but towards attainment of meaningful happiness in harmony with Buddhist spiritual values. So they have an index that brings together health, education, living standards, time use, good governance, ecological diversity, resilience, psychological well-being, community vitality, cultural diversity and resilience, where they try to measure and address and respond to well-being of their society. So there's just one last thing I want to say on that front. Looking at using GDP as sort of a measure of progress brings up a whole realm of gendered organization that's been sort of developed during the last few hundred years to enhance economic expansion and, yeah, try to say it simply here, partly by producing certain humans as masculine with the expectation that they will sell their labor at any cost, at any exchange. they need to sell their labor to be good men, to be good humans, and that will be in the market that we measure by GDP, and that feminine beings will be trained meant to do much labor that's not going to be commodified, that has different sort of motivations and justifications of caring, of care work across generations, and especially of reproducing sort of social and ecological conditions for life to flourish that will be totally outside of market commodification and measure. And then when we have a GDP as your main sort of documentation and instrument for governments to interact with the well-being of nations, it becomes quite problematic, because these really important labor activities and knowledges, which are so vital for environmental and social flourishing, are totally excluded, right? And so there's not much of a political motivation to invest in and value that part of it, and it becomes more difficult for families, for communities, to reproduce healthy and flourishing selves, right? So there's a lot going on there, and many nations have really tried to expand recently and look beyond just measuring the market as a goal for their policies, and also as a way of measuring how well they're doing.
So moving to Mijin, in your article, A Roadmap to an Equitable Low-Carbon Future, 4 Pillars for a Just Transition, you talk about some pillars of a just transition, including strong governmental support, dedicated funding streams, diverse and strong coalitions, and economic diversification. Can you talk a little more about these and what they look like in reality, and how they support the communities they aim to serve in the context of GND?
Sure. This is part of a research project that I did with Dr. Manuel Pastor at the University of Southern California. And we looked at kind of, if you were to craft just transition policies, and we focused particularly on environmental justice communities in California, what would be the things that you would need to take into consideration? And as part of this work, we looked at to see our transition examples from around the world. And frankly, there's not that many that are successful. But I want to talk about 2 examples that I think really highlight both our pillars and kind of understand how we think about transition. With a really, really big caveat that these are both plant-based examples, meaning they're just one site and one plant. And really what we'll need is regional, national, and international transition. So I understand that the scope and scale will be much different, but I think that they're instructive in terms of what needs to kind of happen. So the first one that I'll talk about is Diablo Canyon in California. Diablo Canyon is a nuclear power reactor, and the utility that was operating it, Pacific Gas and Electric, decided not to renew their license because the cost of renewables was so cheap in California, meaning that it was no longer economically beneficial to run the nuclear power plant. So once that decision was made, a coalition came together, which was PG&E, the utility, IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which is the union that represented the workers at the plant, and environmental groups, anti-nuclear groups, and city representatives in the city of San Luis Obispo. And the reason why the city folks were there was because while Diablo Canyon was a nuclear power plant that we can talk about the benefits of nuclear or not, but it was a tax base for the community. So that meant that they'd have a real significant shortfall in terms of money for their schools, for their roads, for their blah, 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 infrastructure. So the coalition came together and they came up with a proactive transition plan that would fund worker transition and retraining. It would fund replacement for tax revenue loss, and it would come with a commitment to replace the nuclear energy with renewable energy. They presented that plan to the California Public Utilities Commission, which would have decided kind of whether or not these costs could be passed on to ratepayers. And here I would say that that's not a great funding example. We don't want to increase ratepayer costs, but we could think about it in terms of what can be done. So they presented it to the PUC, and the PUC decided to accept parts of it. So smaller worker retention plan, they would not fund the tax revenue replacement, and they would not have a commitment to renewable energy replacement. And here I think what is particularly instructive and why we thought it was important to have a strong, diverse coalition was that instead of peeling off, it would have been very easy for the labor union to say, well, our workers got kind of some of what they wanted, so we're done. Instead, they all stuck together and they went to the California State Legislature, and they had the legislature introduce a bill that required the PUC to adopt the original transition plan. So worker retention, worker replacement supports, requirement for replacing that energy with renewable energy, and tax revenue replacement for the local community. The legislature passed that bill. It was signed into law by then Governor Jerry Brown. And then that is now the transition plan. So you can see that, one, you need the government to both support this plan and force the PUC to adopt the stronger plan. You need a debt funding, so that was the ratepayer increase, and you need a strong, diverse coalition. The other example I'll give is in Western New York, in the town called Tonawanda. And in Tonawanda, they had a coal-fired power plant that was the coal-fired operator decided to shut down. And so what the advocacy around it started with the teachers union, because the revenue from that coal-fired power plant funded schools, so they noticed that there'd be a huge gap. So it started with the teachers union. Other unions came on board, environmentalists, community folks, and then they came together with a plan that would have the state legislature fund that tax revenue replacement. So they got the legislature to give them, I think at first $30 million, which was then increased to $40 million, so that the town itself could actually have that revenue replacement. They could have some time to then think about what they wanted to transition into. So as part of that money, they did a visioning process called Tonawanda Tomorrow. And there was an anchor institution, which is a local, I think it was the University of Buffalo. And from there, they had diverse stakeholders come into place and think about, if you wanted to think about envision what Buffalo could look like, what would it look like? And I think this is really important, especially for regions in the US like Appalachia, which has been a heavy coal mining region. And often when you talk to folks and they ask them what you would like your community to look like, coal mining is not ever really a part of it because coal has been such a destructive industry. So they had the folks in Buffalo. Buffalo is also an industrial hub and has really suffered from deindustrialization over the years. What would it look like? So they came up with a plan to attract new industry, right? So they want to diversify away from being monodependent upon one or two industries, attract new industry, new companies, and they also want to attract youth, right? They are kind of an older population. They want to attract young people to come and live in Buffalo and have a longer sustaining tax base. And I think these two examples really show how you can have community-led visioning, and also that you can have, now is really the time that we need to be doing these visioning processes, because in some sense we have the notice now that in 10 years, a lot of our fossil fuel infrastructure has to retire. So if we start thinking about how to do that now, we can have a more seamless transition plan where we don't suddenly close a plant. And you could see, for instance, in Philadelphia, they had an oil refinery shut down very suddenly, and then you're in a period of crises. So labor and community and environment is not able to work together because everybody is in crisis. But we're at this moment now where we have time, we have resources, or at least operating resources. So we can think about, what do we want our community to look like? And what kind of resources do we need? What kind of support do we need? What kind of jobs will be created? And then when we start to transition away from fossil fuel extraction and use, it's a much more seamless transition.
Thank you. So what we'll do at this point is now we are going to take a brief break for around 5 minutes. If folks want to get some water, use the bathroom really quickly, and any other things that you need to take care of, check your text messages. And then we're going to come back for one round of questions that have been prepared by the organizers, and then questions from the audience. So 5 minutes, and then I will regroup us all back. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go back to some of the questions that were meant to be asked for the first half, but I wasn't sure where we were going with time, so I thought, to ask sort of different questions, but in this moment, I just want us to kind of also go back to the topic on workers. So perhaps on this round of questions, the order I'll go in is Bob, Mijin, and then Susan. Around this, as I thought the flow might be better on the specificity of the questions that are outlined here. So for Bob, in a chapter for confronting dystopia, you discuss the necessity of green jobs and necessary considerations for gender to different job sectors. Can you explain specifically what kind of investment and planning is needed and how it would lead to green jobs?
Thanks. As I said before, but I'll repeat because it's critical, investing money in anything will create jobs. Okay, investing in the military will create jobs. Investing in the fossil fuel industry will create jobs. Investing in green energy will create jobs. All of these things will create jobs. So one question is, therefore, okay, what are the actual outcomes that we're seeking? It's not just jobs, it's jobs plus. Do we want to invest in expanding military operations around the world and reinforcing US imperialism? No. Do we want to create jobs to expand the fossil fuel economy? No. We want to build a green economy, basically to prevent a climate catastrophe, and it so happens that that will create a lot of jobs. So some of my research has been about, well, yeah, how many jobs? And what my work, and along with my co-authors, has shown is that when you invest in the green economy, you will create not just jobs, but you'll create a lot more jobs than if you maintain a fossil fuel economy or invest in the military. So that is a positive. But as Mijin said, I think very, very well, investing in these job number and creating jobs doesn't mean they're good jobs. As it happens, and I've looked at this in the US and I've looked at it in other countries as well. And some of my co-authors and former students have looked at it, for example, in China and other countries. A lot of the jobs that, if we take the existing status of employment in what we would call clean energy activities, the jobs are actually worse than what you would get in the fossil fuel industry. They pay less, the unionization rates are less. The proportion of women and minorities in these jobs is low. That is across the board. And the basic reason is, if we want to oversimplify a bit, a lot of the jobs that are going to get created through creating a clean energy economy are going to be in construction and manufacturing. And these are dominated by males. In the United States, they're dominated by white males. So that therefore, as Mijin said, what we have to do is not only think about job creation, but make sure that these jobs are associated with the things we care about. Good wages, unionization, opportunities for historically excluded cohorts of the population, particularly women and non-whites. And a lot of my own work with community groups, and Mijin mentioned Appalachia. I'm actually doing a project now in Appalachia about what a Green New Deal would look like in Appalachia. And so we are focused on this. And that would be true, basically the same. You look at job creation in China, you look at job creation in India, you look at job creation in Indonesia, as I've done, South Africa, we see similar patterns. So incorporating the imperatives of not just job creation, but good quality jobs, of opportunities for voice, representation, i.e. unions, of breaking down the barriers of racial discrimination and gender discrimination in employment. The point is that when we build a clean energy economy, this transformational project creates the opportunity for this whole range of opportunities to get weaved in to the project, building a more egalitarian society.
Thank you. And Mijin, in your article, A Just Transition, why transitioning workers into a new clean energy economy should be at the center of climate change policies, you wrote about some key elements of a just transition that would take into consideration the real consequences of fossil fuel worker transitions when crafting policies. Can you talk more about this?
Sure. And if maybe to make a dialogue, Bob is really the kind of the leading forefront expert on this issue. So I just cite his work. But I would say that, one is the integration of worker concerns into climate policy, right? I think there are still people who are climate advocates that say we should only focus on greenhouse gas reductions equity issues are not climate issues. And I think we really need to understand that equity issues are climate issues. And that, again, if we don't transition in a way that is equitable and just, we will just be recreating the same inequities and injustices of the extractive economy. So when we think about how do we support workers as they transition, as I mentioned briefly, there are these short-term, right, immediate needs. When you immediately lose your job, what do you need? We're kind of seeing it a little bit now in the COVID crisis, all these things that people need for basic supports, just so they can pay their bills, stay housed, and also make sure that they have health insurance throughout this, as they try to figure out, the future careers. And one point that I will say for the long term is that, we talk a lot about renewable energy and energy efficiency as the low carbon future, which is true, but there are other sectors that are also low carbon sectors. Like we could think about the care economy, especially as we have aging populations, that is a low carbon sector. Healthcare in general is a low carbon sector. So what I want to caution away from is saying that, we hear a lot about this now that coal miners will become coders. No. But we can think about other low carbon sectors that need to exist nationwide. And I really think things like healthcare and infrastructure repair and upgrade, these are jobs that will exist geographically everywhere. Where we see now renewable energy jobs are being generated in certain areas, like California is a very good job creator for renewable energy, but the jobs that are being lost are not necessarily being lost in the same regions where renewable energy is being developed. So as we think about job creation, we need to make sure that the jobs that are being lost are in the same, the jobs that are being created are in the same regions where the jobs are being lost. And in this sense, I think we could really expand out in terms of what we think of low carbon sectors. And the last thing that we'll say is that, we need to really think and understand that this is a long-term project. I think we have a lot of fits and starts, and we have some funding that will come in maybe 1 year, 18 months. We're really thinking about horizons of like 10 to 20 years of support. We need to have steady support for 10 to 20 years. We cannot do these fits and starts in terms of supporting communities and workers, or we'll just have the same situation that we have now. We can look at deindustrialization in the US. We had something very similar called the Trade Adjustment Act that tried to support workers and communities. It was largely unsuccessful, and part of the problem was that it started and stopped. It was dependent upon congressional authorization every year. The funding streams were different. So what we really need to understand that this is a long-term investment strategy. It will be expensive, but the consequences of not doing it will be far more expensive. So in terms of supporting workers, I think we really need to think about what jobs are we creating, where are they being created, and ensuring that those two things are aligned. We're not training people for jobs that don't exist, and that we're not creating jobs in places that are experiencing job loss, right? We need to really understand how to create jobs for people who have lost their jobs, and how to make sure that workers that are displaced actually are in jobs that pay the same amounts at least and have the same benefits.
Thank you. Susan, you have sort of talked about or thought through this idea that a major competitor for paths towards degrowth is a highway toward an eco-modernist future where increased economic activity will provide for increased innovations and technologies that will, in theory, eventually fix all the problems caused by economic growth. Surely this is promoted as a convenient reason to justify continued growth, but maybe there is some promise to this. So what are your thoughts on these kind of eco-modernist takes?
Great question. First of all, I wanted to say I really underline what Mijin said. There's nothing inherent about work versus environment. I mean, I can't think of anything more united than a flourishing and healthy environment and bodies and minds of workers in that environment, right? Those things to me are totally interdependent for sustaining a healthy economy over time. So I like thinking about that. All right, at this point, eco-modernism is one sort of movement, maybe somewhat tongue-in-cheek, of people that said, humans are brilliant, we can invent all kinds of things. Sure, we created climate change, ocean acidification, loss of biodiversity, and we can also invent tools to fix those, right? Yeah, more power to them. I mean, I think we should try to invent tools to fix things. I would also like to question the historic processes that led to those to begin with. And I think in some context, the promise of especially sort of elite white Western men inventing new kind of geoengineering tools to fix these problems is a way to avoid asking the deep questions about where our civilization is going. And in many ways, I think those leaders have a lot to do with the climate deniers, which in the US demographically are overwhelmingly white men who deny climate. And both the geoengineers and the climate deniers are basically saying, we don't want to question and change our values and our relationships, our racism and our sexism, our consumer obsessionism. And so either we deny there's a problem or we find a quick fix for it. I don't think that means it's not valuable. We totally want to work with it. I just want to think again about workers and the way workers can thrive in this changing world. In the past 50 years with containerization, computers, AI, human productivity has just expanded to tremendous levels. We humans, we could all work an hour a day and very easily supply everyone's food, shelter, and housing, right? Then we need to ask, what more do we want? Right, and what are the costs of getting those additional things? I'm not saying we should limit ourselves to the basics, but all right, what happens in the current moment is that consumption markets are saturated for many of us. There's inequality, so some people don't have food and housing. But for many of us, we have what we need, and then a lot of brilliant energy is put into inventing new products and services, right? New styles changing all the time. You got to have a different style of car to drive on the weekends, a second house, etc. What type of fabulous weekend in Las Vegas? Things to keep the economy growing and to keep jobs going that I'm not sure. Well, we need to decide, are the costs of those additional production ventures worth it? Are the environmental costs worth it? Are the costs of a system in which many low-paid workers are working 60 hours a week, are those worth it, right? And so I think it would be a good opportunity to sort of be more free to ask those questions rather than to just say, we need to push always for expanding market for 3% GDP growth for more jobs at any cost, right? And some of the policies that we've been thinking about that I'm so thrilled to hear them more in the news these days. For example, universal basic income. Many countries, not the US, already have universal basic services where people have things like childcare, baby care, K through 12, even universities, healthcare at very low prices, right? Those things, we're plenty wealthy enough to provide those. Our country is tremendously wealthy. Those could provide a different type of freedom to workers. Let's say I worked in an industry that was dangerous. It was poisonous, it was dangerous to my body, and I also felt that it was causing degradation to the environment. I may not have a choice, as Mijin mentioned, to give that up because I have a family to look after, I have children. But in a society that has a UBI and basic services, I have more freedom to think about, perhaps I have a partner who can earn a wage job, I can go with the UBI, and together we can form some kind of unit that we have total less work hours, and we value living in a more modest way because it's worthwhile to us, both to have the freedom of time, but also to not expose ourselves to the environmental hazards and not to be part of a system that is causing environmental damage, right? So there's a lot of policy shifts. Many are already much more advanced in Europe than they are now, that can create freedom of space for people to ask those questions. I'm not going to answer for other people if it's right or wrong, but just the freedom to ask, do we need to keep investing, inventing more products and convincing people to buy more products so that we can get more and more hours of work on the road, instead of saying, wow, how can we satisfy ourselves, create opportunities for pleasure, for growth, for satisfaction and community without overworking everyone and without harming the environment.
Thank you. So I'm now going to move to audience questions. We have, I think, 3 or 4 that people have put in the boxes, in the chat box. I think the question is to all speakers, so I'm not really, I think just raise your hand or just go for it. At this point, moderating it will be difficult just because it is to any of you. So I just think either, yeah, start speaking and then the other person jumps in, or raise your hand and I'm happy to call that hand. So the first question is, where does the issue of land use fit into decarbonization, degrowth, and even the GND? The person says, I was thinking that converting urban rural land back into forest or tree covered areas would not all sequester significant amounts of carbon, which would help bring carbon emissions to 0, but would provide people with novel ways to spend their time. At the same time, it would likely lead to lower economic growth, which would, under the current production regime, hurt people's livelihoods. So go ahead, Bob.
So that is a really important question, the issue of land use. In the article that you cited at the beginning and that I wrote in the New Left Review, I summarized some research by a really great researcher. Her name is Mara Prentice. She's a physics professor at Harvard. And she did some really important calculations, and I've kind of built off those in estimating the land use requirements for getting to a clean energy economy. So in Prentice's model, summarized very briefly, roughly speaking, we can pretty easily capture about 50% of all the energy we need through putting solar panels on roofs. Not just houses, but commercial enterprises. And then if we put them in parking lots, you know, we're getting to 50–60% of the requirements that we need. Now, secondly, if we think about putting wind turbines in agricultural lands, Prentice estimates that we could get, let's say, another 25–30% through maybe using about 10% of existing agricultural land. You say, well, wait a minute, then they're not going to be able to be farmers anymore. No, actually, they'll be able to continue to be farmers. You only have to use about 5 to 10% of their land, and they actually like it because that gives them a second source of income. So as a way of actually reviving rural economies in the United States and elsewhere, this is a great model. And in fact, it's being used in the United States right now in the high wind regions of the, you know, the Great Plains states, where we have already 30–40% of existing electricity being generated by wind power on agricultural lands. So it is certainly a challenge to think about land use, but you know, it is not something that is going to be decisive if we plan out the clean energy economy carefully, that we can get most of the energy we need in a high efficiency economy through using rooftops, through using parking lots, through using agricultural land, and the rest, I mean, you know, things like geothermal energy actually don't take up any land at all. I mentioned the building that I work in here at UMass, which is a net zero building. This is, you know, this cold climate, we have solar panels on the roof, we have geothermal energy, just, you know, we pump it up 500 feet below up to the building to maintain a more stable level temperature. It is a very high efficiency building. We invested in efficiency. So in this cold climate with, you know, long winters, we are at net zero. And you can do that anywhere in the world. And that's the path that we need to think about. And I would just say, finally, on this degrowth versus Green New Deal, which kind of spins us into all kinds of useless things. I would just say, if we think about all of those activities, putting solar panels on rooftops, building geothermal systems for office building. That is growth. That is expenditure. Whether it adds to GDP or not is not my point. The point is it will, in conventional accounting, it will add to GDP. Contracting the fossil fuel industry will contract GDP. I don't care one way or the other. That's not the debate. The debate is how do we get to zero energy, and we have to massively expand the clean energy system and make it efficient.
Do any of the other two panelists want to respond to this, or can I move to the second question? Susan, yes? You would like to respond or no? I can't hear you.
You can go ahead. Actually, I'll just make a very short response, is that, Bob, when you're thinking about degrowth, I see you keep conventionally saying that degrowth is about reducing GDP. Many degrowth people are pretty indifferent or agnostic about GDP, right? It's thermodynamics is a major thing, like is the total amount of matter and energy that the society is going to be transforming and using and creating entropy out of it, is that growing or shrinking, is another issue that people are thinking about. But I also wanted to add about the land use, both in Indian and Amazonian communities that I've worked with for many decades. People have traditions of managing great areas of land with quite low population density through ritualized processes of long-term fallow and changes of forest and crop, swidden agriculture, different things, which allow humans to live in quite fragile environments over a long time. But they also create not only carbon sequestering biomass, but also the biodiversity, the space for biodiversity to keep our biomes back up. So both atmosphere and biosphere are enhanced by those, which are, again, it's something very distant maybe from the life that we're leading at this moment, but it's a way that humans have survived for many, many more centuries than we have in our current economic systems or technology systems.
So I'll let Bob, if you can follow up with that, and then I'll move to the second question.
Very briefly, because it is an important point. I wouldn't dwell on it, but I just want to be clear. I think I said I don't care about GDP. Yes, GDP, no, I truly don't. But what I do care about is that we have to massively expand investments in clean, renewable energy and massively increase investments in raising efficiency levels. If we don't do that, we will never hit the emission reduction goals set out by the IPCC. There is no way we're going to get there. I have never seen a single model, including Peter Victor, who I respect a lot. You must dramatically increase. Now, it so happens if we take the conventional GDP accounting, that will mean an increase in GDP. And when we contract the fossil fuel industry, that will, by conventional standards, that will mean a reduction. That will mean a degrowth of GDP. Yes, it will. But as again, to emphasize, I don't care. I don't care. What I care about is hitting the emission goals. That's the critical thing. And we shouldn't keep getting caught up in GDP yes, GDP no. There's no way to stabilize the climate unless we substitute clean energy for fossil fuel energy.
Thank you. So the second question builds on the first, and the person asks, in this panel, the speakers often mention being carbon neutral. However, based on what I have learned about climate projections, with the greenhouse gases we have already emitted, we seem to be already slated to experience a significant degree of ecological collapse and immense human and economic damage especially to more vulnerable communities. I was wondering what their opinion is regarding whether there's any hope of having a carbon net negative and avoiding that level of damage, whether through carbon capture, tree planting, or any other endeavors. Mijin?
That's a great question. And I would say we should plant a gajillion trees. I think in New York, they were trying to plant 1 million trees. All of those natural ways of capturing carbon, I think are great. I think we have to accept that we are already in a climate crisis, right? We are already seeing the impacts of climate change. So what we're trying to do is stave off the worst impacts of climate change. What I am less excited about and much more skeptical about are these technologies like carbon capture and sequestration. One, because they're very expensive. Two, they have yet to be proven effective. And three, I think that these are ways to just continue our fossil fuel infrastructure, right? So we can continue to burn coal, we'll just capture those emissions. That I don't think is the way to go. But the other things like planting trees, regenerative agriculture, I think those are very good ideas to also reduce our emissions.
Anybody else on this? Okay. There are lots of questions now. So this goes back to a question specifically, I think, for Mijin, but the person is saying, also inspired by Dr. Cha's mentioning of nuclear power, I was wondering what the speakers might think about the topic. To my admittedly limited knowledge on the topic, it seems like some of the main disadvantages of nuclear power are that it requires a much greater initial capital investment compared to a fossil fuel plant, and also that culturally it is faced with very negative public opinion, and that the risks of danger is actually significantly lower than is generally perceived. Considering that the dangers of fission power generation appear minimal compared to overwhelming damage of continuing to rely on fossil fuels, could it be viable to switch our primary reliance to nuclear fuels? Bob, go ahead.
So the proponents of nuclear energy, which includes some, very distinguished climate scientists, argue that nuclear does not create any greenhouse gas emissions, and we know how to do it. And it's already contributing about 5% to total global energy supply, so why not build it out? I myself disagree with that position, and I agree with the person who raised the question. First of all, there's the issue of radioactive wastes that result from using nuclear energy. Previous research had said, okay, radioactive wastes are going to continue for thousands of years. I was actually in a debate a few years ago with one of the major proponents of nuclear energy and said that, well, there's new ways of utilizing nuclear energy which solves the problem. And she concluded that radioactive waste would only be active for 300 years. Oh my God, only 300 years. What a breakthrough. That's really not acceptable. Secondly, we have the issue of the dangers of plant meltdowns that we saw with Fukushima. And Fukushima happened in 2013 in Japan. And Japan is a country, as a high-income country with pretty good regulatory structure. After all, Japan is the country that suffered most as a result of nuclear energy. So they're sensitive to these issues. Nevertheless, they had a meltdown. And some of the proponents of nuclear say, well, not that many people died. Well, we don't know over time how many people died, but nevertheless, the most recent estimate of the cleanup, we're looking at the numbers in the hundreds of billions of dollars to get to the point at which the community is safe again. Now think about, let's say, a developing economy that does not have the budget for a regulatory environment comparable to Japan. If you build out nuclear energy, you will have less regulation and you will have more susceptibility to accidents. On top of that, you have the political issue that nuclear power designed for energy can be transitioned into nuclear energy designed to build bombs. It's not exactly one for one, but you can get there. So if you say there is no choice, we have to have nuclear energy or we're going to burn up the planet, I would say, well, then, okay, let's go with nuclear. But it also so happens, as the questioner raised, if you look at the cost today, put out by the US Energy Department under Donald Trump, if you look at the cost of nuclear energy today to generate 1 unit, 1 kilowatt of electricity versus solar or wind, solar and wind are like half the cost of nuclear. So why in the world would we transition to nuclear if it costs less to build out the clean energy economy, and it is infinitely safer?
Yeah, Mijin.
And I just wanted to point out Adrian's comment in the chat, which is also really important, that it's an equity issue because nuclear fuels are often extracted from Native American lands, but then the disposal also goes to Native American lands. So, and just to emphasize again Bob's point of like, why would we choose this, right? So we know solar and wind is much cheaper and much quicker to deploy. But then also if you think about just transition, that equity issue is really a real concern.
So as we're on the polluting question, you know, somebody is saying they're inspired by Professor Cha's case studies where polluting power plant shutdowns cause fiscal difficulties for local institutions, and Professor Pollin's point about differences in geographical distribution of new renewable energy jobs and losses of polluting jobs. The question is there a case for public finance to be less tied to local economic activity?
Sure, yeah. I think that, yeah, I think there is a case that finance should not be tied to local economic activity, but I do think that you need to invest in local economies. So I think that's what I would have to say about that.
Okay. Moving to, this is for Susan or Mijin. We've spoken about the policies that current governments can do before 2030 to avoid catastrophe and ensure a just recovery. Oftentimes, when we speak about a just recovery, we also talk about how to build new structures of governance to ensure that we build towards a more equitable future for workers. How do you think we could reimagine our democratic and community-based structures to facilitate greater equity in our society with a just recovery in mind? Susan, do you want to attempt that?
That's a crucial question. It seems that in the past 40 years or so, the rules of the market have been changed bit by bit to facilitate trickle up. In the Americas, where I work, the mid-20th century, there was economic growth with greater opportunity, greater intergenerational mobility, greater equity in many cases from 1930 to 1970s. Then the rules of the market got changed in response to recessions and complex factors to create 40 years when we've had growth of inequality across most of the nations in the Americas, right? So the rich got rich in unprecedented ways, and many people, their situation didn't improve or got worse, right? So basically for me, this idea of some kind of democratic community processes where we're talking about environmental decisions, we're talking about New Green Deal, it can't really work in a world where socioeconomic inequalities are so extreme that billionaires' voices and corporation voices in politics are so differently weighted than workers and home dwellers and other people. So for me, that's one of the many things to start with, is to think about changing the rules of the game, some of the rules of the game, to allow our economies to create more collaborative growth of wealth, right? That empowers people to participate democratically. And I also think another positive piece of this very complex puzzle is supporting, again, more collaborative and common spaces and properties and resources. In a society where resources have increasingly been commoditized and privatized in individuals, including even things like kindergarten and elementary school, right, where people are going to private schools now and things like that. Again, the money plays into it and makes it quite difficult for people to build collaborative democratic structures. So I think instead of investing all the subsidies in corporations to make them grow because they're going to lead us to a GDP 3-point growth, we could invest some support and subsidies in collaborative management of local things, of educational initiatives, care initiatives, food provisioning, who knows, all kinds of things, which I think would be just one more piece of the many stuff that needs to go into building this space, which I love this question because I think this is perhaps one of the most powerful places we need to work to build a healthier society and planet. So Mijin, go compliment that.
I think that answer was perfect. I don't have anything to add.
Bob, any thoughts on that? No, you're good. Okay, well then we have one last question, or maybe two, I don't know. What are metrics that we can use to measure greenhouse gas contributions other than emissions? Go ahead, Bob.
Well, first of all, and I've seen through the chat over the course of our discussion that some people have asked about emissions other than CO2 generated by burning fossil fuels, and that is obviously very important. So as I think I mentioned, if we look globally, emissions from fossil fuels, burning coal, oil, and natural gas, 65%, 70% of overall emissions. You throw in burning wood, emissions from burning wood, you're up to 75%. In the US, 80, 85%. So the first thing you do, we have to focus on the things that will achieve the most quickly. And that first thing we have to do is eliminate fossil fuels. Now, then there is emissions from methane and nitric oxide. And those are the two other big sources. Methane emissions are much more toxic than CO2 emissions. So if you get small methane emissions, for example, critically, fracking to mine for natural gas leads to leakages. And even if you leak 5% of the gas in a fracking operation, that 5% leakage would mean that the whole process of bringing natural gas up and burning it is worse than burning coal. So if you frack, that's worse than burning coal. So natural gas is no such thing as a bridge fuel. So those, the other sources of greenhouse gas emissions are critical. Then beyond that, well, yes, we need to think about natural carbon sinks, the most important being forests and soil. And so, yes, we obviously have to defend, first of all, the Amazon and stop clear cutting in the Amazon. And if we transition to supporting our forest lands, reforestation, if we transition to organic farming methods, that will absorb something like 10 to 20% of emissions. And so that's how you can get to a net zero or even a negative emissions economy, within this 30-year time frame that we have.
So we are, oh yeah, Susan, go ahead.
I just have a very short addition there. I agree that greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 are the most urgent thing that need to be touched on. We've discussed mainly them. And I just want to make clear that when people are thinking about degrowth, the main goal is degrowth societal metabolism. Stop the expansion of societal metabolism as a whole. Greenhouse gas emissions, part of that, but also part of it is all the matter and energy transformed. Wood cut down, wood burned, minerals mined, water used, all of that contributes to entropy. It's not only the greenhouse gas that's causing, we're more aware because it's become more acute for us. And I think those processes of entropy also interact in the atmosphere, in the aquasphere, in the biosphere to create changes. So, right, so we'll act in a focused way to address CO2 right now, but also think about all the different types of resources that we're transforming and using every day, and we can see that as a package.
Thank you. So we are out of time. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left. And I am cognizant that the organizers do have an outro that they would like to make. So I want to thank you as the moderator for your insights, for your amazing and important work that all of you are doing, and for your really informed presentations today, and for just being really amazing at being so mindful of time and sharing of space. So thank you all for your contributions today. Sophia, if you want to take over.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for this amazing discussion, and to the audience members for attending our webinar. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Robert Pollin, Dr. Mijin Cha, Dr. Susan Paulson, and of course, Dr. Chandni Desai for joining us tonight and sharing their expertise. I really enjoyed listening to the discussion and definitely learned a whole lot, and I hope audience members have as well. In case you missed something or want to rewatch the webinar, it was recorded, and a video with closed captions will be up on our YouTube channel soon. We will also compile all the resources and links mentioned during the discussion into a document that will be shared via our social media platforms. To make sure you see the video and the resource document once they're up, please follow UCLit Sustainability on Facebook and Sustainability UCLit on Instagram. And one last time, because we are always looking for more friends, if you're a U of T students interested in doing direct climate action work, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'll be hosting more events like this throughout the school year, and we welcome anyone in helping us out. Once again, thank you to our wonderful panelists and Dr. Chandni Desai for moderating, and I hope everyone has a fantastic evening. Thank you.